In this lecture, we're going to discuss Chapter 3 of your textbook, which focuses on phrases. One of the things that we're going to discuss is the difference between phrases and clauses, because people often confuse the two. Clauses we'll discuss in the next chapter, Chapter 4, the next lecture, so I hope that by the end of these two lectures, it will be clear what is a phrase and what is a clause. A phrase is a group of related words that does not contain a subject and a verb. A phrase functions together as a part of speech. Three different kinds of parts of speech. A phrase can function as an adverb, a phrase can function as an adjective, and a phrase can function as a noun. There are two types of phrases: the prepositional phrase and the verbal phrase. I think you're all familiar with the prepositional phrase. The verbal phrase is a little bit more difficult to comprehend, so we'll focus on that in a little bit of detail. Verbal phrases are broken down further into three subtypes: verbal infinitive phrases, verbal participial phrases, and verbal gerund phrases. A prepositional phrase always begins with a preposition, and we discuss prepositions in the parts of speech lecture. A prepositional phrase always ends with its object, which is either a noun or a pronoun. In between the noun or pronoun and the preposition can be modifiers. The modifiers are adjectives, which would modify the noun or the pronoun that is the object of the preposition, and adverbs, which would modify the adjective. Prepositional phrases can move around in a sentence, but generally they are located near the words that they modify. Prepositional phrases always function as either an adverb or an adjective. If the prepositional phrase modifies a noun or a pronoun, it is functioning as an adjective. If it modifies a verb, it is functioning as an adverb. So here's some examples. We went to the movies last night. The prepositional phrase to the movies modifies the verb went and answers the question where. So it functions as an adverb. Where did we go? We went to the movies. The man in the black coat is a spy. In the black coat is a prepositional phrase. Black coat modifies the noun man and answers the question which man. So it's functioning as an adjective. It gives us more information about the man. At the beginning of this lecture, I said that a phrase is a group of related words that does not include a subject and a verb. So what is a verbal phrase? The verbal comes from a verb, but it is not a conjugated form of the verb. It does not have person or tense. Non-conjugated verb forms include the infinitive and the present and past participles. The infinitive of a verb is formed by using the word to plus the stem form of the verb. For example, to go, to see, to study, to eat. This form of the verb is the root. It has no person or tense attached to it. Participles, as we've already learned, come in two flavors, the present and the past. The present participle is formed by adding ing to the verb stem. There are no irregular present participles except that most verbs that end in E drop the E before adding the ing. You maybe remember that rule from when you were younger. So bite, for example, bite, has a present participle, biting, but the E is dropped, so it's biting. Separate ends in an E, but separating drops the E after the T before the ing. And we also have some exceptions. For example, the word see, S-E-E, adds the ing without dropping the final E. But for the most part, present participles are regular. The past participle, however, is both regular and irregular. For regular verbs, the past participle is formed by adding ed to the verb stem. If the verb is irregular, however, then the past participle is the part that's irregular. These forms you most already know, and they just have to be learned. So, for example, thought, brought, told, sold, hold, gone, and so on. These are all irregular past participles. In conjugated verbs, the past participle is used to form the present perfect, the past perfect, and future perfect tenses, which we've already studied. I have sung, I had sung, I will have sung, or I have tasted, I had tasted, I will have tasted. When the present participle, when the participle is not conjugated, it has no person or conjugated verb, then it cannot function as a verb. It can function as a verbal phrase. As I said in the previous slide, infinitives are used to identify the root form of a verb. Infinitives, however, can be used for more than just defining the root form of a verb. They can be used as verbal phrases that function as nouns, adjectives, or adverbs. An infinitive phrase consists of the infinitive, an optional object, and optional modifiers. Note, however, that you should not confuse infinitive phrases with prepositional phrases. In the sentence, to the store, I went to the store is a prepositional phrase. It's also an adverb modifying went and answers the question where. But is it not an infinitive? How do we know? Because an infinitive always has the verb immediately following the to, and to the store does not have a verb following to. Also, I said previously that infinitives do not have person or tense. Infinitive phrases, however, can take some tenses and also voice, but they still do not have person. So, for example, the verb to think, that's the root form. It has neither tense nor person, but to have thought is the present perfect form of an infinitive phrase. To have had thought is the past perfect of an infinitive phrase. To be thought is the present passive of an infinitive phrase. And to have been thought is the present perfect passive of an infinitive phrase. So let's look at some examples of infinitive phrases. First one. Our goal for this class is to learn English grammar. Now, the subject of the sentence is goal. The verb of the sentence is. So we have a linking verb. So what does that mean when we have a noun followed by a linking verb? What follows the linking verb has to be either a predicate adjective or a predicate nominative. So our goal for this class is what? What is the goal? The goal is to learn English grammar. That makes the infinitive phrase to learn English grammar a noun. Therefore, it is functioning in the sentence as a predicate nominative. Let's look at the second example. My mother always told me to be brave. Who's the subject of the sentence? Mother. What is the verb of the sentence? Told. What did my mother tell? She told me, which is an indirect object. And what did she tell me? To be brave. Brave is the direct object of the verb to tell or told. She told me what? She told me to be brave. So the infinitive phrase to be brave is functioning as a noun, which is also the direct object in the sentence. It's the direct object of the verb told. Let's look at the third example. The goal to strive for is excellence. What is the subject? Goal. To strive for. What is that? It's describing which goal. Which goal is excellence? To strive for. So we say that's an adjective. It's a verbal phrase that describes goal. So it's an adjective. All right, and then in the final example, I went to buy a loaf of bread. The verb went, the subject I, to buy a loaf of bread. This can only be an adverb because it is describing the verb. It describes why I went. I went to buy a loaf. Or you could even argue that it describes where I went. I went to buy a loaf of bread. In both cases, it doesn't matter if you ask the why question or the where question. It functions as an adverb. Now note in my examples here, I do not have any present perfect, past perfect, present passive, present perfect passive examples. The good news is that those forms are not used very frequently. So the only point that I want to make with those is that you at least recognize that they're also in infinitives functioning as infinitive phrases. So to summarize what we've said about infinitive phrases, infinitives can have tense and voiced when used in a verbal phrase. Infinitive phrases can have an object and modifiers. So for example, in the sentence to learn English, we have an object. What do we want to learn? English. Or they can have a modifier to be brave. What do we want to be? Brave. Or they can have a full complement object, not just one word. To buy what? A loaf of bread. It's also an object. So the point is that the verbal phrase is not just the infinitive to buy, but all of the words that follow that are part of the verbal phrase. And then verbal phrases can function as nouns, adjectives, or adverbs, and they can modify an entire sentence. As we noted in the previous slide, infinitive phrases are a little bit more complicated in that they can function as nouns, adjectives, or adverbs. Participial phrases, however, always function as an adjective. They are also located near the noun or the pronoun that they modify. They can also have tense and voice, and they can have modifiers. They always begin with the participle and end with the object. So let's look at a couple of examples. Being the oldest member in my family, I had the most responsibility. Being is a present participle, and so the present participial phrase, being the oldest member in my family. Notice that the object of the participle is oldest, and in my family is a prepositional phrase that describes oldest, so it is also a modifier. So the whole phrase is being the oldest in my family. All right. It modifies the pronoun I. It describes who I is. I am the oldest in my family. So being the oldest in my family is functioning as an adjective that modifies I. The second example, having been told that he is handsome, Joey fell in love with Julie. Joey is the subject of the sentence, and we have again a present participial phrase, having been told that he is handsome. Now here what you notice about this participial phrase is that it is in the present perfect passive voice. If it were just the present participle by itself, it would be telling. But it's not telling. It's have been told. Having being the present participle form, been indicating the passive voice, and then the past participle, which we've learned to create the passive voice. So the passive voice conjugated would be I have been told. So as a participial present passive would be having been told. And then the clause that he is handsome is a modifier of the participial phrase. So having been told that he is handsome is describing Joey. So once again, it is an adjective. Now, a couple other points to note here. When a participial phrase starts a sentence, it must modify the first noun or pronoun that comes after it in the sentence. So in both of my examples, being the oldest member in the family describes the first pronoun in the sentence, which is I. Having been told that he is handsome, the first noun in the sentence is Joey. It has to describe the first noun or pronoun. If I wrote a sentence such as, driving down the highway, the car started to overheat. That would be an example of what we call a dangling modifier, and maybe when you've written papers before, your professors indicated that you have a dangling modifier. The dangling modifier, the participial phrase driving down the highway, does not describe the car. It describes the person driving the car. The car is not driving down the highway. So the participial phrase is called a dangling modifier, meaning that it is not correctly identifying or describing the subject of the sentence. So one way to fix that would be to identify the subject. Who is driving? So driving down the highway, I got a fright when the car started to overheat. Then it's clear I is the person who is driving down the highway. So that's something that you definitely have to look out for when you're using present and past participles as adjectival modifiers. All right, we have one more topic to discuss, and that's gerund phrases. Now, I said previously that present participle phrases and past participle phrases are always used as adjectives. A gerund, on the other hand, is the present participle that is used as a noun. So, one of the areas of confusion that we commonly come across when we're studying this topic is that people get confused between a present participle phrase and a gerund phrase because they both begin with the present participle. The distinction is that a present participle phrase is always used as an adjective, whereas the gerund phrase is always used as a noun. All right, so a gerund is a noun. A gerund can be the subject of a sentence, it can be the direct object, or it can be the object of a preposition, just like a noun can be. The gerund can also take objects, and it also can take modifiers. So it functions both as a noun and as a verbal form. So, some examples. The gerund phrase saying goodbye starts with the gerund saying, and it also has an object, goodbye. What am I saying? Goodbye. So saying goodbye is always hard. Saying goodbye is functioning in this sentence as the subject of the sentence. It is a noun that is functioning as the subject of the sentence. The next example, I never have fun saying goodbye. Saying goodbye in this example is the direct object of the sentence. It is the direct object of the verb have. What do I have? Fun saying goodbye. Then, in the third example, where's the fun in saying goodbye? Here we have a preposition in. And what is the object of the preposition? Remember, the object of a preposition must always be a noun or a pronoun. So the object of the preposition is saying goodbye. The gerund phrase, which is functioning as a noun, is functioning as the object of the preposition in. So that's all there is to phrases. Easy, right?